Hey, Dr. McClellan, just wanted to say, first of all, thank you so much for all your videos. I feel like at this point I should be paying tuition because I've just learned so much from you.
Hey, thank you so much for the kind words. That means a lot.
And I had a question
All right, let's see it.
that starts in the Garden of Eden, where God is preventing Adam and Eve from gaining this superior knowledge of good and evil. And similarly, at the Tower of Babel story, God is once again preventing mankind from going up in their ziggurat, mixing around with the other gods, having increased sovereignty over the earth. We also get the story after the flood where God limits human lifespan to 120 years. And so in all these things, it seems very clear that God does not desire for any human to gain the qualities and properties of the gods.
Yes, I would argue that the three main narrative arcs within the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11, so that would be the story of Adam and Eve and their family, the story of Noah and the flood, and the story of the Tower of Babel, which are interspersed with genealogies, are primarily etiologies or origin stories for why humanity is the way it is, and they address some of the main, most widespread anxieties about the human experience in the ancient world. Why are we limited in so many ways? Why do we die? That death anxiety is a big part of it. And these are stories that explain how things got to be the way they were. And the author or editors responsible for the way we see the stories today are probably holding up God as kind of the foil to our aspirations to all the things that deity is. So we want to achieve immortality, and God is there to stop us. Humans, for some reason, want to have sex with gods and have demigod children, and God is there to put a stop to that. We want to build a tower to heaven and make an immortal reputation or name for ourselves, and God is there to stop us. And so this is using God as the foil in these etiologies for why humanity has the limitations that it does. And you see a lot of other literature from this time and place is doing very similar things, explaining why humanity is mortal, why humanity is limited in their knowledge, why humanity is limited in their power and their abilities in comparison with the gods. So yes, in that sense, God is the antagonist in these stories rather than what we later understand God to be, a protagonist who is on our side.
And then we get to the New Testament, where suddenly believers in Christ, followers of Christ, are not only granted immortal life, but they're also co-ruling and co-reigning with Christ over creation. They're judging angels. And so my question is kind of twofold. Firstly, is there a view of post-mortem deification of Christians in the New Testament?
Hey, that's a great question. I would say there's absolutely a concept of theosis or divinization in the New Testament. And there are a number of scholars for many, many centuries who have acknowledged that. In fact, within Eastern Orthodoxy, there has long been a doctrine of theosis or divinization. I think we see it bubbling to the surface most clearly in the Gospel of John, with concepts of Jesus' followers becoming sons of God, with concepts of Jesus' followers becoming one with Jesus, the same way that Jesus is one with God. I think we see it in the Pauline literature with ideas about becoming like the stars of the heavens. The stars were considered gods or angels in that time period. So Paul is talking about ascending to a spiritual heavens where we replace the wicked deities that will fall at some point. In the book of Revelation, we have within the letters to the seven churches these promises about people falling down and worshiping, and about sitting down in Jesus' throne the way that he is sat down in God the Father's throne. And a lot of this is borrowing this imagery from what was going on in Second Temple Judaism, which also talks about humans who are worshipped by everyone on earth. About, for instance, Moses being told by God to sit in God's own throne, in God's place. We have a lot of different concepts of people ascending to deity. Melchizedek is another example. But yeah, it's definitely coming through in the New Testament, and there are even some Christian streams of tradition that have picked up on it and still consider it doctrinal. And if you'd like more info on how the earliest Christians understood this, Norman Russell's book, The Doctrine of Deification in the Greek Patristic Tradition, is great.
And secondly, whether there is or there isn't, when, where, how, why did these views develop when it seems so clear in the Hebrew Bible, in the tradition, that humans are never supposed to gain these divine qualities, and yet all of a sudden in the New Testament we have these views that, oh no, this has been God's redemptive plan from the very moment that Adam and Eve sinned in the garden.
Hey, thank you for a great question. This is really the product of the convergence of two streams of tradition. One that is preserved in the scriptural heritage that is the Hebrew Bible from a much earlier period, and that combines with a tradition that develops within the Greco-Roman period. So the earlier tradition first. When the primeval history was written between around the 7th and the 6th centuries BCE, there was no concept of divine reward or punishment in the afterlife. Everyone went to Sheol, no matter what. And there was an afterlife. It was kind of a murky existence that wasn't really explored very much within the literature. You were just kind of thought to exist, and there were threats in the afterlife, and there were relationships that the deceased could maintain with the living, and you were basically thought to exist as an individual as long as you were remembered, your name was invoked. It's very Coco-esque in that regard. But when we go back into the Bronze Age, into the Iron Age, we see that curation of that relationship taking a shape that very much overlaps with the concepts of deities. For instance, when people were buried, you created a mortuary chapel that usually had some kind of image or representation of the deceased. You brought the deceased food, you brought the deceased light. You could even provide the deceased with a throne or things like that. These were material media that manifested their presence and allowed you to interact with them. Ask them questions, request blessings, provide food for them, the exact same kinds of things that go on in temples. In fact, in the early period, the ancestors, deceased ancestors, were referred to as deities, as Elohim. We even see this in the story of the necromancer of Endor, for instance, when Saul goes to visit her. The deceased Samuel is referred to as an Elohim, as a deity. And we even see archaeologists debating when they pull up an artifact, is this an altar on which sacrifices were offered to a deity, or is this an offering table on which offerings were made to ancestors? There's significant overlap between those concepts, and I talk about that in some detail in my open access book, Adonai's Divine Images, which you can access on my link tree. And two other good books that discuss the concept of ancestor worship and the nature of the afterlife in the Iron Age. One, Chris Hayes, A Covenant with Death. Death in the Iron Age 2 and its rhetorical uses in Proto-Isaiah. And then Carrie Sonia's book, Caring for the Dead in Ancient Israel. Now, in the 7th century BCE, we have Josiah's cultic reforms, and one of the things that they are doing is trying to stamp out ancestor worship. And so that mostly goes away. But we still have within the scriptural heritage this notion of ancestor worship, this notion of ancestors being divine. And so then in the Greco-Roman period, we have the rise of concepts of post-mortem reward and punishment. And on the reward side, we have these significant human figures from the past who are considered in some sense to be divinized. So Moses, who's called an Elohim in Exodus 7, Melchizedek, Abraham, and others. We see traditions popping up within Greco-Roman period Judaism about them being gods. And so we have the development of this concept that the post-mortem reward for the particularly righteous is to unite with the divine. And we see this in the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, for instance, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is an idea that is primarily taking shape within Greco-Roman period Judaism and then is picked up within Christianity and interpreted in a few different ways and carried on from there. But it is the result of the preservation of this older idea about ancestor worship and the deceased ancestors being deities, combining with the Greco-Roman period innovation of the idea of post-mortem divine reward.